Okay. I think the four panelists here have given us lots of food for thought. Any questions or comments from anyone, including you guys, by the way? If you want to lead back in, you're more than welcome. Yes, sir.
Like they say, the Bible do not change, but like the Old Testament is eye for eye. Then the New Testament they tell you to turn the other cheek. You know, that's changing, ain't it?
So your question is, how do we kind of reconcile the idea that the Bible doesn't change?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to give some good theology here. All right. One, I would say, again, I don't represent all of Christianity in my approach to this. Certainly there'll be some people that have would explain this and talk about this differently than I do. I would also like to say that for me, my biggest question, the first thing, if in the classic situation, the first thing I'm gonna ask when I get up there, if it works like that. That's one of the most difficult questions for me in theology is the disparity seemingly between some of the representations and some of the activities that's attributed to God, some places in Scripture, and then some of the teachings of Jesus. That to me is if there was anything that could have gotten me to walk away from my faith at different points in my life, it's that question. So I identify a lot with that question. There's different ways of talking about that particular kind of passage. Some theologians have talked about what they call a progressive revelation, which is to say that God has worked with people throughout time wherever they're at. So in the Old Testament, when God is establishing a different kind of people, and so you have what you have when you have an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is basically a limitation on what people were doing at the time. So what they would say then is, back in that day, you poke out my eye, I chop off your head, right? Like there's this unlimited vengeance kind of thing. Like I'll do whatever I want in regards. And so that law was there to say, look, you can't take more than a pound of flesh just because someone, to try and regulate that. And what they would say is progressively throughout the theology then, when Christ came along, Christ redefined that and said, no, I know you've, which is always the funniest thing to me is Jesus says, now you've heard it said an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, and I kind of picture everyone being like, yeah, it's in the Bible. Yeah, we have heard that. Jesus heard that a lot. You've heard it said an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. I say turn the other cheek. And I think at that point, what I personally believe Jesus is the fullest understanding we can have of God. So, which means a couple of things for me. It means that as I'm reading through Scriptures, if I come to a place where I cannot reconcile something with Jesus, I side with Jesus, and then I'm prayerfully trying to figure out why that seeming discrepancy is there. And I would say that Jesus gave a fuller picture of what God's true character is. I think we have glimpses of it throughout the Old Testament. You have things like the lion laying down the lamb, beating the swords and the plowshares, things that indicate that violence, when God's kingdoms come, when things finally work the way God actually intended them to, there won't be any more violence, there won't be any more hatred, no more enmity. And so, progressive revelation is one way of talking about that. Someone else who has a different kind of holding of Scripture would say, well, there's a certain group of people that kind of wrote things from their perspective, and then Jesus came along and tried to self-correct it. Now, that wouldn't jive with some people's view of Scripture. If you say everything in the Bible, nothing's supposed to change in Scripture, well, then you got to find another way around that. But for me, and I'm a total simpleton, I really do go by the thing that if there's something that doesn't fit with what Jesus taught, I go with Jesus and I pray to work out the details. Jesus is a standard that I bend everything else to, if that makes sense. But that's a huge question. Believe me, I would love to know the answer to all that fully. I feel like the answers I have they make me feel a little bit better about it, but I wouldn't say that it answers it completely for me either. I'm still struggling with it.
Like one morning I went over to Jeff Pose's house, and a dude, he kind of told me, it kind of opened my eyes to a different, he was like, a second chance. If you don't never give nobody a second chance, then, but like this world, they don't give you a second chance. If you're a convicted felon, you cannot get certain jobs. But if you paid your debt to society, why is that?
So I was define for me the question again. I'm sorry. You're saying society doesn't give you a second chance generally. Okay.
Like I had a job at I'm a convicted felon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I had a job at 49 at the auction.
Mm-hmm.
And once my history came back, that same day he picked me up and told me he wanted to give me a higher position because I learned the whole operation. But then about 30 minutes later, he come back down and say, Drake, come ride with me. And he said, you know, your background check came back. He said, if I had anything to do with it, you wouldn't have to worry about this. But our company don't hire convicted felons.
Right.
So he had to fire me. And now I had to go back and sell drugs instead of working. But now I would have got caught selling drugs. I had to go back to the penitentiary.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not, did he kind of make that decision based on Christian claims?
No, it's just the company.
Right. I mean, I would say that certainly a central tenet to the Christian faith would be the idea of redemption and forgiveness, second chances, all of those things. The majority of the New Testament was written by a murderer. I mean, Paul murdered Christians, and most of the New Testament, David, a man after God's own heart, was an adulterer and a murderer. All the disciples fled and ran. A small girl asked, "Do you know this Jesus guy?" And they're like, "Nope, never heard of him." Took off. Right. So the Bible is riddled with felons in a very literal sense and figuratively. And so I would say, in the center of the Christian faith is the idea that there is redemption for anybody, and that there is no one so tainted that God has. I mean, to believe in unconditional love, agape love, which is a central, again, Christian tenet, is to believe that there's nothing we can do to make God love us any more or any less than God does right now. That's a central part of what we believe. Certainly, that's not something we realize a lot down here. And I would say situations like what you're talking about are perfect examples of how we don't interact like that down here. And ideally, we as Christians are learning how to manifest that here.
Can I inject over here? For you, the only thing that I can tell you, brother, with what he's say about his statement, have faith and pray. Have faith and pray. Have faith and pray.
I prayed, I got faith.
Have faith and pray. I mean, whatever you pray, brother, just keep praying, and it will come along.
See, I had to start my own business. I got a car detail shop.
Don't give up. Now, my answer is don't give up. Just have faith and pray and try. And that's all what we can say to you.
Thank you.
Can I have two separate things. I work as a government contractor in the military. And since 9/11, this seems like this whole country has been busy protecting ourselves from ourselves. There's a level of fear that has been promulgated that I think has had I think that religious intolerance has sometimes been a political agenda here. And so I had one of my workers today couldn't get on the military base I work on because they've done a background check and they keep doing them. And what I would suggest to you, and this is a suggestion that a secular humanist would make, is go see if you can go back to the judge and get that felony adjudicated and thrown off your record. It can be done. So, and then...
But I worked on the Army base. I worked with the company Austin's and Associates. It's a catering service. I was a KP, but they got took over by Sanjo. And I ain't go back to, I would have had to do a whole new process. So I just started my own detail shop and tax place.
Practical idea. Get that felony removed. It can be done.